Hello guys and girls, how's it going? And today, boy oh boy oh boy, we have an important tank. Does that mean it's a good tank? No. But important? Yes. Das Panzerkampfwagen 1 und 2 und 3. Yeah, the first German tanks of the 1930s era. Well, technically, kind of. The German tanks that are the most important. Both the Panzer I and II were designed as a stopgap to keep the army ready for the true tanks of the German army, the Panzerkampfwagen 3 and 5, which were the true medium tanks of the Wehrmacht Panzer Corps. The Panzer I was envisioned as a training vehicle. It was never meant to see frontline service, really. It was there for training future tank crews. However, due to lack of more advanced tanks for frontline service, it was there. It was put into the army because there was dire need. So it had to use all it could, including training tanks becoming their main battle tank. Before we talk about the tank, we need to talk a little bit on the history. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 did not allow Germans to have a large standing army, or tanks and certain other military vehicles as well. The command knew that tanks were the future and thus wanted them in their army. But how could they do this? Well, with the Grosstraktor and the Kleintraktors, essentially tractors for field work, with tracks and armoured hulls and guns, because rabbits are a real problem in Germany. Anyway, the first Panzer, the Panzer 1A, came to production in 1934 and continued until early 1939. Around 800 of these first models were built. This tank had a few problems and only 13mm of armour at the thickest point. The commander had the job as the gunner, the loader, and the commander. The driver was of course there to drive. The engine would constantly overheat, and the only way to communicate between the driver and the commander was through vocal tubes. Although this was meant to be a training tank, or a light scout tank at most, it did end up with main panzer divisions until 1941. The Panzer 1B was a vast improvement, and that's what we have in game. With the Panzerjäger and the Flak Panzer, it went on to be the chassis for a fair few German vehicles, which was produced from 1936 until 1938. Some 675 were built. The B was longer by 40 centimetres and had an extra bogey wheel, and the new powerful and reliable water-cooled Maybach NL38 engine, although the armour and weapons remained the same. In late 1940s, 7 were armed with the Czechoslovakian 47mm, giving us the Panzerjäger. Others were equipped with the 15cm howitzer, giving us the Sieg 33 Bison. This was probably the most overloaded chassis with a gun on it of all time, and resulted in a very slow vehicle. Although never really meant for battle, the Panzer I and IIs made up almost half of the German Panzer Corps until the fall of France. The Panzer I was actually in use with the Spanish until 1954, which is pretty good for a tank that was just meant for a stopgap measurement. Although it was basically obsolete when it was launched, Panzer I formed the backbone of the German tank corps, and was part of all major campaigns from 1939 until 41. The Panzer I contributed to the Blitzkrieg method of attack, and it really formed the German main attack strategy, which saw them gain so many victories. It also formed the basis for all future tanks for the German military to come. Where have I gone? Anyway, now let's go on to the Panzerkampfwagen 2. The Panzer II was basically a larger version of the Panzer I. It was fitted with the new Rheinmetall KWK 30 20mm autocannon. The gun was a version of the 2cm flak 30 gun, which had a 600 round per minute capability. It had a very good high velocity rate of fire. A very good high velocity shell with a good rate of fire, with good overall penetration values capable of going through the majority of light and medium tanks at mid to short ranges at the time. It was also armed with a 7.62mm Rheinmetall Borsig Model 34 machine gun. It was also better armoured than the prior tank, with up to 14mm of armour. This was of course enough to stop high velocity anti-tank rounds, but would protect... Sorry, it wasn't enough to stop high velocity anti-tank rounds, but would protect against shrapnel and small arms fire. The powerful 6-cylinder Maybach HL62 engine was used on almost the entire series, giving the tank 140 horsepower. The increase in size meant that the crew of two could now be 3 crew members: driver, loader, radio operator, and commander/gunner. The advantage of a radio was a huge... the advent of a radio was a huge advantage at the time, and gave the Panzer II a massive advantage over the majority of other tanks of the time, which still relied on hand signals and flag signals to communicate. Originally, the Panzer II had a similar suspension system to the Panzer I. Small road wheels in pairs fitted with bogies. However, the later versions, starting with the C, had larger road wheels which had independent suspension, giving better overall cross-country capability. It was also slightly longer and wider, giving more room. Another improvement was the armour, now a whopping 14.5mm. Later variants, which we have in game, had extra armour bolted onto the front, up to 35mm of armour. The C was the most common and widely used through the war, in production up until mid-1941, and was the most available tank for the Panzertruppen. The Panzer IIF was a major improvement due to lessons learned from the wartime experience. A new single piece of 30mm front plate armour was installed, and the gun mantlet was increased to 30mm. A new commander cupola was added, with the new KWK 38 20mm autocannon. From March of 1941 until December of 42, 524 units were built. One disadvantage was the new F variant was heavier and had a worse power to weight ratio of only 14.7 horsepower per ton. The F also got the new tungsten core solid shot ammunition rounds, meaning this tank had a very good anti-tank capability at short ranges. However, this range was in short supply, which meant it didn't get as much use as it could. It didn't get as much... it would have been a much better round to have in the field, basically. Later versions, the D and E, were much less effective, using a Christie-inspired transmission suspension system, which proved unreliable off-road and was scrapped. The original version was used on the later F variant. The Panzer IIF Flamingo was a conversion of the D and E tanks into a flamethrower tank. It was pretty much only used on the Eastern Front, however it had limited success. Later versions of the Panzer II were made to heavy reconnaissance tanks. These had thicker armour and were upgraded with the French 37mm gun and the German Pak 38 50mm guns. The Tiger Cub, Panzer IIJ, was another version. This was actually a complete redesign from the ground up. The tank had up to 80mm of armour on the front, with 50mm on the side. It had the KWK-20 autocannon still, which meant it was deadly to light vehicles and infantry. However, it did struggle against light and medium tanks. Only 22Js were built, and most lost at the Battle of Kursk. It was designed as a scout tank with the ability to survive an ambush. It wasn't designed to lead a head-on assault. And last but not least, let's talk about the Panzer IIL, the Lutzens, or the Lynx. One of the most famous reconnaissance tanks of Wehrmacht. 104 of these were made, from 43 until 44. It had similar road wheels to the Panther, and pretty much looked like a mini one as well, along with a new 180 horsepower Maybach engine, giving this tank a top speed of 37 miles per hour. On the road, it also had much better turret armour, with 30mm of standard armour. It was still equipped with the KWK 38 20mm autocannon, but had a good long-range radio system with a fourth crew member added, meaning the commander could now focus on his job commanding the vehicle. The Lynx fought until the end of the war. The Panzer II chassis went on to form many vehicles of the German army, from the Marder II, the Wasp, SPG, and the Birkenlager, basically a bridge layer. By the end of the war, nearly 145 Panzer IIs were still in action, although most were now used as reserve tanks. Although the Panzer III and IV are more iconic, the Panzer I and II were by far the most important tanks of the German army. They were the basis for the early tactics. Although light, they had good speed and reliability. One last thing I want to speak about today was the original tank, Corps Cross. Now, you'll notice in this video I have a white cross on the tanks and the Hungarian basic Air Force one. Now let's just head back to the hangar here. And we'll just show it in the hangar view. So I've got the Hungarian cross here, and this was the original layout of the actual German Panzers. The Panzer I and Panzer II had the white cross on it. Now, it was there for the added ability for spotting Allied tanks. However, this had a major negative effect, as found in Poland. The white cross gave anti-tank crews the perfect spot to aim for. This led to the tank corps painting it black with a tiny white outline. So the iconic German cross that we have now, originally it was this white cross. Now, where it was positioned was probably some of the weakest points of the tank. Up on the gun mantlet, it was actually a lot weaker than what we have in game, with only 15mm of armour. And basically this meant, with having nothing behind it, that any anti-tank round could penetrate it and would take out pretty much the entire crew, leaving the tank pretty much incapable of doing anything. Now let's have a talk about the tanks we've got in game. So we don't actually have a Panzer I in game technically, but we do have the, let's just bring it out quickly, the Panzerjäger, which I've never actually used in game, interestingly enough. Let's just replace that Panzer 35T. The Panzerjäger, and there's the upgraded cross, which is the Panzer I chassis, and as you can see it's got the Panzer I suspension system, which has the brace across for the mid-wheel section as well. Now this is basically a Panzer I, so the Panzer I would have this section here, and of course the standard turret. But you get to see the armour. It's very lightly armoured, there's hardly anything to it, and you can see how much smaller it is to the Panzer II as well. Also, of course, the Flak Panzer as well, which again is a Panzer I chassis. Again, it's the Panzer I. This whole front section is Panzer I. This back section's chopped off, and then the 20mm Flak 38 cannon is placed on top of it. So you can see here how small the tank is. When comparing it to the Panzer II, Panzer II is much wider, has much better armour, more crew, things like that, but it does suffer. It doesn't have great armour in all honesty, and the biggest problem is the gun. The 20mm KWK-30 is not very good for penetration. Now you will be able to penetrate certain spots, as you do have around about 60mm of pen with it, with the upgraded tungsten rounds, but it still does have problems, mainly with American tanks. I'm trying to think of it and I can't think of it, so I'm going to look it up. The Stuart, the M3 Stuart. The Stuarts are the biggest problem you will face. If you actually just look at the Stuart armour, it has very good frontal armour, which has a bit of sloping on it. Now, although it's only around about 40mm of armour, 38mm, it has good sloping, so at angles it can be hard to penetrate. So this can be a tank that is really, really pesky to deal with. The M3A1 Stuart as well is just brutal when you're facing it, because it does have very good armour. The turret armour is pretty much impenetrable with your guns. The front armour does cause a lot of bounces. It is very hard to take out. So at low tiers it can be problematic. Also with, of course, the French tanks. These were facing the French tanks in the war, and they had problems penetrating the French tanks from the front. Of course, the French tanks had problems penetrating them from the front as well. So generally the tactic was to flank them, get to the side and take them out that way. However, you can take out the majority of French tanks if you do aim for the centre of the turret. So let's just look at the S-35 here. If you aim for the very centre part of the turret, because it has got very weak turret armour, you can hit this section here and you will take out the tank. You will get a lot of bounces and things like that, though, with many of the tanks. All in all, the Panzer II is a pretty decent tank. It's a fun little tank to play. The autocannon's pretty good. It's not great, but it is pretty good. I would really like to see the looks added into the game. I think we do need it. Also, the Panzer J as well is another tank that could well be added to the game. It would be a perfect tank to be added to the rank 2 to rank 3 area as a light scout tank, which is something we do lack at the moment for the Germans. Effectively, the Germans only have the premium vehicles, which is the RU-251 and the pack version of the Puma. They're the only two tanks that have scouting capabilities, and that really, sorry if you can hear the parrots outside, they're making a bloody racket. They're the only two scout tanks, so having the Panzer IIJ and the Panzer IIL would really be an improvement, and the Lynx would be a good mid-tier tank, you know, around about 4.0 sort of area, so that could be a really effective vehicle. Anyway, let's stop the video here. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's a bit of a whopper video for talking. I can't believe I actually got it out so quick. I managed to not have many stammers and fluffs of lines there. And like I said, it was probably one of the most important tanks of the German army. This, believe it or not, is just a brief overview as well. I would recommend looking up the full history of this tank and watching some of the documentaries as well, because it is a very interesting vehicle. It's not the most iconic tank of them all, you know, it's not iconic like the Panzer III and IV. You know, the Panzer IIIs and IVs, they have that iconic German tank look, but you can see as they develop, you know, the Panzer I, very small, lightweight, sort of doesn't really have that look to it. The Panzer II starts to have that Panzer look to it, although it does have a slightly off-centered turret. And then the Panzer IIIs and IVs, that's what you imagine when you think of a German tank. That, and of course the Tigers. But it gives the basis, and what they learned from the Panzer Is and Twos went on to form the Panzer IIIs, the Panzer IVs, the Tigers, the Panthers. You know, it went on to really improve the German tanks and make them the formidable machines that they were by the end of the war. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and, well, until next time, this is Screezler out. Bye-bye.